Okay, we are recording. I am Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and I'm joined today by Julian Dodd, who is Professor of Philosophy and head of the School of Philosophy, Religion, and History of Science at the University of Leeds in England. Julian, thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be here, Brandon. Thanks very much.
Awesome. So we're talking about your book, Being True to Works of Music, which came out in Oxford University Press in 2020. And in that book, you're giving an account of authenticity, right? That realizing a musical work in performance authentically. And there are a number of views of musical authenticity with respect to works of Western classical music on offer. And I think the most mainstream one, or the one that a lot of philosophers hold, is score compliance authenticity, right? That being true to a work of music, to realize it authentically in performance, is to comply fully with the score, such that the more fully a performance complies with the score, the better. So the ideal being 100% compliance, right? Doing everything the composer says to do. And you're arguing that no, that's not the right view, that your view is interpretive authenticity. But before we get to your view, could you just briefly talk us through what score compliance authenticity is and what reasons people give in support of that view?
Well, I suppose, I think you've done a very good job in explaining what score compliance authenticity is. It comes by degrees. Thought is that the more compliant you are with the instructions encoded in the score when you perform a work, the more authentic, in that sense, the performance is. Normally, actually, in the literature, this is given a kind of historicist twist, because it's the score. It's been compliant with the score as that score is interpreted in accordance with the tuning conventions and performance conventions that were in place at the time of composition. So, for example, a common thought is that to be fully authentic in performing, say, a Baroque oboe concerto, you've got to use a Baroque oboe, which is quite different from a modern-day oboe. Much less key work, sounds more trumpety. In fact, when my daughter, who was an oboist, expressed an interest in learning the Baroque oboe, she was told by her teacher that she'd be going over to the dark side if she did that. So that's kind of, roughly speaking, score compliance authenticity. And I've always thought that, in a way, the historical spin placed on it is a kind of it's been very important in the practice since the 60s, I suppose. To me, it's always looked a little bit of a side issue. There's a deeper issue around here, which is why do we want to comply with the score? And are there other values that are equally or more important? But going back to your question, so that kind of introduces the issue that I'm really interested in, and heartily recommend a piece by Guy Rawbo on this as well. Why play the notes? Came out in the AJP a year or so ago, and I suppose that I'm kind of guessing here because, to be honest, many people in the literature kind of haven't really, it seems to me, haven't really dug deep to excavate the reasons why they think that score compliance is such an important value. I think probably there's this thought that we're in the business of performing the works composed by those composers, and that as performers, we're kind of sonic postmen. We're meant to be delivering to an audience the work as conceived by the composer. Now, normally, such philosophers of music say, well, of course, insofar as performance, work performance here is a performance art, it involves interpretation. And so performers don't just deliver, aren't just meant to deliver the work to the audience, but interpret that work in performance. But my suspicion, and it is just a suspicion, is that for such philosophers of music, the notion of interpretation is entering the scene too late. Typically, people say, well, we have to interpret the work because the score underdetermines how a performance should sound. As if the score didn't do that, there'd be no place for interpretation. And my thought is that in Western classical music, performance is interpretive in a much deeper sense than that. It isn't just, as it were, an accident of the indeterminacy of the notation that makes performance an interpretive art form. It's that these works are performed in order to be interpreted. In fact, they're performed in order to be understood, and that we value performances insofar as they evince an understanding of the work performed. And that's where the notion of interpretive authenticity comes in. It is just that notion of kind of performing a work in a way that evinces understanding of it. And you'll notice that if you read criticism, often the ultimate praise by critic is that this was a revelatory performance, and what they mean is typically that it sheds light on the work that hasn't really been shed before. It's uncovered something that other performances haven't uncovered, made us think about the work in a new way. So my notion of interpretive authenticity is a way of being true to the work that consists in performing it in a way that evinces understanding of it. And like score compliance, it admits of degree. So performances are more or less interpretively authentic. So I suppose, kind of scrolling back a bit, authenticity is a matter of being true to something. And Western classical music is a very work-focused art form. We're interested in the works composed by composers. But depending on, I suppose, the nature of that being true relation, you might have different, kind of notions of authenticity in play here. And one we've talked about in a fair amount of detail already, which is score compliance authenticity. One's true to the work by virtue of following the instructions encoded in the score for performing it. But my thought was that there might be another way of being true to the work, which is just performing it in a way that evinces understanding of it. Because I think we're all aware that there can be, as it were, page-turning performances of a work of music that don't really evince any great understanding of the work. So my thought was that we've got these, that we shouldn't think of authenticity as just one thing in Western classical music. There are these at least two kind of different conceptions of authenticity, and I thought that they might come into conflict, and I think that's where I thought the interest in this area was, when they come into conflict, because it's quite a familiar phenomenon that performers sometimes sense that the way that a work is elaborated in some of its detail can sometimes undercut what you might call its point or its overall integrity, which is kind of how I think of the meaning of a musical work, what's to be understood in it. So there might be a distinction. I think Nick Cook, the musicologist and critic, says this. There's a distinction between the content in a work of music and its, as it were, its material realization. And so it might well be that on occasions, rigorously following the score actually undercuts the project of trying to evince or bring out the meaning of the work better in performance. And as I said, I think that's where the interest lies. And I think that the practice is one in which conductors and performers are kind of sanctioned on occasion to ignore some scored or kind of deny, ignore work against, not follow certain scored instructions, if they think that does a better job of bringing out the work's point, its rationale, doing a better job of representing its overall integrity. So in the book and in kind of subsequent work, I've kind of talked about particular examples of that. And what's interesting, it seems to me, I mean, sometimes that the kind of position I'm setting out is characterized as one in which, well, what the performers do here is that they disobey the score because they prefer, they think it sounds better this other way. Whatever sounds better is meant to mean. That's not the position that I endorse. It's not that it sounds better, that I prefer it. It's that the work seems to demand of a performer, if the performer's to really succeed in bringing out the meaning of the work profoundly, it sort of demands of the performer that they depart from certain scored instructions in order, precisely to kind of evince the work's meaning more effectively. So, I mean, I'll just give you one very brief example I've talked about ad nauseam over the years, which is, I suppose, a controversial one. It's the tempo instructions in the first movement of Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata, which Alfred Brendel, no mean pianist, thinks are far too fast. And he thinks that if you try, if you attempt to obey the metronome marks, then you lose what really matters for Beethoven's music: the orchestral color, the orchestral nature of it, the expressiveness. It just becomes a mess because no pianist can play it at that speed while preserving all of that. So what you've got to do, if you're Brendel, is ignore those metronome markings to bring out the color, the expressiveness, the tone quality in that movement. So I'm not anti-score compliance. I'm all for it. In fact, I think it's a final value in the performance of works of Western classical music. But I think where there's a conflict between score compliance and this other kind of authenticity, interpretive authenticity, performing the work in a way that evinces a profound understanding of it, it's interpretive authenticity that is the more fundamental. That's the idea.
Yeah, awesome. And so, I mean, there's a lot there to dig into, and I'll just raise a few points and see where you want to go with them. So one thing is that I think that, people who are advancing score compliance authenticity, right? They have I think a really strong metaphysical view about the nature of musical works. And I don't know how much of that is under the influence of like Nelson Goodman, who thinks that, if you don't realize the piece of music 100% note for note, you have realized a distinct work of music, right? And so that's one thing. Another thought is, you mentioned, especially with the historically informed performance movement, right, that it's very much sort of under the thrall of the genius of the composer, right? This very romantic notion that the composer's the genius. What we're doing in performing the work is we're realizing their intentions. What access do we have to their intentions? It's in the score. And so we need to follow that. And further, we need to realize it in the way that they intended, which is historically accurate, right? That we want to basically produce the same sonic qualities that were available in the concert hall, when the work was first performed, then we want to do that now, right? But, that view seems to me problematic in the sense that, well, even back then, it would have varied from concert hall to concert hall, especially if you're, dealing with, before equal temperament or something of that sort, right? That different, chamber orchestras or different quintets from town to town or from time to time would sound differently, or they'd be using slightly different instruments that would sound differently. And so, trying to recapture what it would have sounded like that's really misguided. I mean, I think, Peter Kivia has all sorts of arguments against the
Yeah.
historically informed performance movement. And I think I've, rehearsed some of them just now.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I had another thought, but I lost it. So I'll stop and let you respond.
Let's take them in reverse order. I think that kind of supporters of the historically informed performance movement wouldn't say they're trying to recover any particular was much kind of recover a particular way of playing it, but just obey the instructions in the score as they were intended by the composer, taking into account the conventions for performance and tuning, etc., that were there in place at the time. Of course, in the Baroque period, most performers compared to modern standards weren't particularly good. So it's not trying to replicate any particular performance. It's trying to kind of it's really aiming for an ideal, as that ideal is determined by the score, interpreted in line with the relevant period conventions. But there is an interesting question here, which is why is it the conventions that were in place at the time of composition that are relevant for interpreting the score, rather than the conventions in place at the time of performance? And sometimes in philosophy, I think we need to slow down a bit and ask questions like that. Because you might have a conception, I think Scruton's got this view actually. You might have a conception of musical works as kind of composed, handed over to performers to interpret, on the understanding that there may be means of interpretation or kind of interpretive styles that might become, that perhaps the composer him or herself hadn't anticipated. That, as it were, these works are living things rather than things behind a glass in a museum, and that future generations, centuries on, might have kind of insight into how they're best performed that would actually conflict with the composer's own opinion. That's an interesting question, it seems to me, and quite a difficult one to answer. But it seems to me also not to be obvious that the historically informed spin on score compliance, viz., that you're supposed to interpret the score in accordance with the conventions in place at the time of composition, is the obvious view to hold there. The other thing was, people are going to worry that if you're kind of performing works and deliberately flouting scored instructions, aren't you performing just different works? And here, I think, again, we might need to slow down a bit. So it seems to me there are two distinct questions here, which is, and before I get to that, yes, I think that, as it were, the identity of a work of music is just determined by its score. Okay, that's how we distinguish one work from another work, typically. And yet there are two. What is it to perform a given work of music? And here I'm in accordance with someone like Stephen Davies, actually, that, to count as performing a given work, well, the sounds you make have got to kind of, roughly speaking, match, the score. You've got to intend to, kind of abide by most of the scored instructions. And maybe there needs to be a causal intentional relation, causal relation going back from, the performance to the composition. But there's nothing terribly mysterious about the idea that you can perform a work while deciding to depart from certain scored elements. So there's one question, which is, do you count as performing this work? Well, I'll play it a little bit faster, I think, than the score prescribes. And I think that, you know, once we step out of the philosophy room or the philosophy of music room, there's no problem about that. And then there's a question of what is it to perform the work in a really convincing, that's to say, kind of interpretively authentic way, which kind of brings out, as it were, the rationale, the point of the work, which does something to kind of lay bare more clearly why in general it unfolds as it does. That seems to me is a wholly different question. And you know, a really funny thing, it seems to me, kind of, well, funny, a kind of an oddity is that, for example, in theatre, I don't think we have too much of a problem with the idea, particularly when we're performing, you know, when a company is performing, say, you know, Elizabethan or Jacobean plays, that a bit of tinkering is allowed and you still count as performing that play. You know, the RSC has put on productions of Shakespeare where they haven't just cut certain things or changed some of the language, but added bits. And no one said, oh, no, that's no longer Hamlet, right? So it's something of a puzzle as to why people think that, well, you know, if you depart from a few scored instructions here or there, you're no longer performing Beethoven 9 or Mahler 5. So I think I want to keep those two questions apart, kind of the, you know, what is it to perform a work and what is it to perform a work convincingly in a way that evinces understanding of it? And you know, I really think that the idea that, you know, you can count as performing the same work even when you do depart from the odd scored instruction is just there in our thought and talk and our practice. I think it's kind of, it's philosophy, which is you know, kind of pushing us towards a view of that practice, which is not in accordance with our manifest image of it.
Yeah, right. And that's what I was going to say, that your view seems very much interested less in metaphysical questions and more in capturing the actual practices of performance, which are a living, changing, evolving thing. They're not stuck back in a particular period of time, that these things change and evolve over time. And I think the analogy you drew to theater is exactly right, that there are all sorts of ways of performing Shakespeare, right? And, you know, and that's not to say that, you know, historically informed performances of Shakespeare, right, that use the original language, that try to capture how it would have sounded, you know, to Shakespeare and his contemporaries, right? That's not to say that those can't be revelatory or really interesting or brilliant, right? They absolutely can be, but so can these other ways of performing Shakespeare. I think the same is exactly true of classical music, which is exactly your view.
I think that's right. I mean, it's kind of interesting why there is this disanalogy in our attitude towards these two art forms. I mean, you know, philosophers of music do say things like this. So there's this famous case where Beethoven scores a certain kind of figure for the bassoons when this is in the recapitulation of, I think it's first movement Beethoven 5. That the exposition was given to the horns, because the recapitulation is in a different key. The horns at the time, you know, couldn't have handled those notes, so he obviously scored it for the bassoons. Now we've got, you know, valved horns. Many you know, conductors, you know, give that little motif to the horns, thereby disobeying Beethoven's scored instruction. One of whom was you know, Karajan. And I think if you said to Karajan, "I'm sorry, you're no longer performing Beethoven 5," I mean, he'd have given you the Karajan stare. I mean, it's just kind of obvious to everybody in the concert hall that this is Beethoven 5. He's just changed a little thing in performance, just disobeyed that little scored instruction. But yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, but ending up denying that that's a performance of that work is something that, you know, it has to be driven by a certain philosophical theory or a certain philosophical picture. Yeah, I mean, it may well be, I think what happens often in the philosophy of music, actually, that personal taste becomes solidified into something which is meant to be some kind of philosophical imperative or norm. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, so we're in agreement about that. You know, and I think you know, it's something that I've always thought. The metaphysics of music is really interesting, but I don't think that the connection between one's metaphysics of music and one's account of the normative profile, as it were, of the music is so tight. You know, so I think that the kind of Platonist view, which I put forward many years ago, is entirely compatible with everything I say now. I just don't, you know, some philosophers of music, I suppose, think that once you get the ontology right, it determines what you say, or largely determines what you say on the evaluative side. And I've never really thought that's true. You know, so in a sense in which, you know, the metaphysics just leaves everything else where it was.
And can you talk a bit about why you think that? Right. Because I mean, there's a sense in which, you know, I can see what's motivating the view that you're against here, right? That look, once you start changing little things here and there, and I mean, this is, you know, Nelson Goodman, right? That once you change, you know, a note here, a note there, why can't you change all sorts of notes such that, you know, I think Goodman's example is, you know, Beethoven's fifth becomes Three Blind Mice, right? That,
I mean, I mean, Goodman's a brilliant philosopher, but that's just a bad argument. I mean, you know, I think that on any sensible account of what it is to perform a work of music, it will allow for a certain amount of departure from the score before you count as not performing that work and performing something else or doing something else. You know, on the kind of view that Stephen Davies holds about what it is to perform a work of music, that's true. And Stephen's a big defender of the, you know, hardline score compliance, authenticity, kind of historically informed, you know, that movement. I just think often what we have to do is just distinguish questions. You know, as I said, the question of what it is to perform a work at all, to count as performing that work, however well or badly, is a different question from the question of what it is to perform that work convincingly in a way that evinces understanding of it. And I don't think we should just, you know, elide those. It's another way of saying that the question of, you know, what makes a work the work that it is a different question from what it is to perform that work, indeed. So there are lots of different questions here, and I think we have to slow down. And once you kind of address those questions and distinguish them, then I think it's for the other person. I think the boot's on the other foot. I think it's for the other person to say, well, what you know, your views on ontology or your views on work performance will just determine what you want to say on the evaluative side. As I said, I think that, you know, the ontology of music is very interesting, but I don't think it has these evaluative ramifications that others think. And I think, you know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So, you know, I'm not going to rehearse the argument now, but the final, I think there's an appendix in the book where I just say, look, here's how you could accept everything I've said in this book and still be, you know, a Platonist of the stripe that I kind of elaborated in, you know, in my previous book. You know, yeah. It's
great. So I want to push your view to see how far it'll go before it breaks. Okay. So if it'll break here, right? That, you know, your view is essentially that, just to repeat what we've been talking about, right? That interpretive authenticity is, you know, interested in evincing understanding of the work, which seems to be evincing understanding of the composer's intentions, right? And if we can do that with obvious geniuses like Beethoven and Mozart and Bach, right? That we can tinker around a bit here and there if we have strong interpretive reasons for thinking that, if we change this thing, we'll, evince a greater understanding of the work, right? And thus, in a sense, realize the composer's intentions. If we do it with geniuses and brilliant composers like that, couldn't we do the same with mediocre composers, right? And so Friedrich Nietzsche, he may have been a decent philosopher, but apparently he was a very mediocre composer of works for piano, right? And, you can imagine him, which I think he did, giving Wagner some of his scores for Christmas or whatever, right? And Wagner looking at them and, looking down at them and deriding them as these are really poor. But you could also imagine him giving them to Liszt, say, who's maybe a more sympathetic person, right? And, brilliant pianist and composer, right? No slouch. And looking at Nietzsche's compositions and saying, oh, I see what he's trying to do there. I get the ambition. The ambition is way beyond his abilities. And so I'm going to perform the work in line with what I think his intentions were. And the result is radically different than, what Nietzsche notated. And is that compatible with your view, right? That we have, that Liszt has given an interpretively authentic performance of Nietzsche's mediocre composition?
These cases are really nice. So, a couple of things. So first of all, you started by saying, well, when someone, thinks that the norm of interpretive authenticity conflicts with that score compliance authenticity, what they're saying, what they're doing is they're thinking of, as it were, the composer's intentions as not being adequately realized in the detail. And what they'll do when they depart from some of that detail is better realize the composer's intentions. Now, that's one way of thinking of what's going on, but it needn't be the only way, right? Because that brings to bear a view about how, what musical meaning is and how it's determined, a broadly intentionalist view. And one needn't take that view. For the at the moment, we could be neutral on that, and many, I think the experience of conductors, composers who do sometimes ignore individual scored intentions for the sake of bringing out the meaning better, is their experience is that they just study the score, right? Think hard about the music, and they can see that there's this behind it, that it has this, there's this sort of point or overall integrity, but that point needn't be the point of the composer. The composer could be completely, detached from what's really going on in their own music, perhaps, right? So I'm not going to, I'm not necessarily going to accept that kind of intentionalist view of musical meaning. It's always been a slight puzzle for me as to why, when it comes to artistic meaning, philosophers of art go Gricean from the off. That's a deep question. I haven't got much more to say about that. The second thing, I mean, the mediocre composer. So this is an interesting one. I mean, or think about the composition student and the tutor, right? Tutor might have some sense of what the composition student is trying to do, and, as it were, with their instrument might make some changes, or kind of depart from the score to better bring out what they think is really going on in that music. That's fine. That would be a case of, I mean, it could be a case of just like the kind of more highfalutin cases that I've been talking about. But then you started to talk as if, these works were just so bad that really major revisions would be needed to make kind of, to make it make sense at all. And often, in the kind of cases I think you're alluding to, it's really unclear what the music's driving at, because the composer is not skilled enough with the medium. It's just a bit of a mess. And then I think I'm tempted to say something else. I mean, in your example where, Nietzsche's piece is given to Liszt and it comes out sounding very different. Now, it looks like now we're moving over to a case where there are so many departures from the score that it is very tempting to say, no, this isn't a performance of that work at all. It's an arrangement of it, or it's a fantasia based upon it, or it's just a new work with the original work used as a stepping stone to get there. So then I think we can raise the other question of what it is to perform a work at all. And there has to be quite a lot of match in the performance to the score, I think. I think in that, the kind of case you're thinking of there, Brendan, I think it would be a case, it's likely to be a case of the performance of a different work. And yeah, I mean, that locution, yeah, I can, the good composer can see what the mediocre composer is driving at. Often that's I mean, that points to something some way short of a sense of what this work of music is really about. And often we use that locution to say, well, maybe they'd like to perform a work a bit like this, compose a work a bit like this. But then again, I think we're going over to the sort of, to the new work being composed here by the tutor, or in your example, by Liszt. I mean, there isn't a hard and fast answer to the question of there isn't a line which distinguishes, on one side of the line you've got departures from the score where you still count as performing the work, and departures from the score where we're more inclined to say that, it's an arrangement or a transcription or whatever, or a different version, or of course there isn't a line, but that seems to me to reflect the practice, that there are going to be some very difficult cases. I mean, something else that's important in this kind of case too, I think, is, well, what's the tutor, or in your example, Liszt, intending to do? Are they seeing themselves as bringing something out, or as performing the work in a way which brings its meaning better to the surface or clarifies its meaning? Or are they taking an idea by a composer and just composing a better work with that kind of rough idea? So again, I think we need to kind of think hard about how we're going to describe these examples in detail, and maybe pick apart some of the different cases here. But it's a very interesting question. I mean, yeah. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, awesome. Well, Julian, thank you so much for joining me. This was a really terrific discussion.
Oh, thanks so much, Brendan. Thanks for, reading the book. I mean, thanks very much.
Awesome. Thanks.
Okay, take it easy.